Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere. I am your host, Connor Jones, as you know, and I'm here to share another story from northwestern Wyoming, which is just about as close as you can get to the middle of nowhere. But before we get started, here's a message from our sponsors. This week's episode is sponsored by Bason's Market, located in Bason, Wyoming. Bason's Market is your destination for groceries, fresh produce, and the best meat department in the Bighorn Basin. Come on in and sample their wide selection of products Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Sundays from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. We're also sponsored by the folks at the Wyoming Welcome Program. They're excited about their service called Table Talk. Table Talk brochures are placed on restaurant tables in Cody and Powell, and they're filled with fun facts about Wyoming, jokes, and the month's holidays. In addition to this information, they include ads from local businesses, so if you're interested in being included in a brochure and getting your business name out there, please send them an email. Their service is affordable and effective, and you can contact them at Haley J, that's HALEYJ, at wyomingwelcome.com. And now, the podcast. We have now made it through a full week of school here in Powell, and it's gone really well. I'm pleased with this batch of students, and we've been having a lot of fun in Spanish class and PE. And just throughout the school, there's a lot of energy, and it's good to see. I know that coming back to school isn't what every kid is looking forward to, but they've been awesome this week, and I hope it continues. We're still in what educators like to call the honeymoon period, where the students are still new to the school, or new to their new classes and the new teachers, and hopefully all of that newness doesn't wear off and lead to, distracted behaviors and all those things that tend to come to a middle schooler. We've got kids from 11 to 14 years old in the middle school, and it can be hard to sit and listen and play school when you're that age. But so far so good. Been having a great week at Powell Middle School. My oldest son, Ruben, has also started kindergarten, and that's been a little bit rough for him. He's kind of scared. Being the oldest in a family and going to school, breaking that school barrier, that can be kind of challenging. So there have been a few tears, but he really likes his teacher and has some friends, so we're hopeful that it will get easier for him. Well, I'm also talking in this podcast about a beginning. This happens to be my first ever 2-part podcast. So this is the beginning of a story that I have titled That Time Things Went Downhill Pretty Much from the Beginning. So here goes. It has been my experience in life that things usually go as planned until they don't. The only uncertainty is whether things will start to go downhill early or later on. For some people, the anxiety of waiting for that moment when things start to go downhill keeps them on edge and leads to things like premature baldness or bad digestion. One option for avoiding such stress is to deliberately start out by going downhill. Such was the case with our hike down Carroway Canyon. On that hike, we decided to dispense with the suspense and simply began the 2-day trip by going downhill. And then we just continued going downhill from there. From a hiking point of view, going downhill is supposed to be the easiest form of hiking. There's hiking uphill, which usually requires a lot of effort, such as when climbing a mountain. Then there's hiking on flat ground, which takes less effort and is generally accomplished in places like Nebraska. And then there's hiking downhill, which should be the easiest of the three. That being said, there really is too much of a good thing, and this is painfully true when it comes to hiking downhill. To give some context to this story, the Carroway Canyon hike took place soon after one of the greatest events of my youth, the day my dad took over as Scoutmaster of Troop 41. Ask any Scoutmaster, and they will tell you one of the best aspects of being a Scoutmaster is the fact that, like paying taxes or climbing stairs, you don't have to do it forever. Some Scoutmasters end their tenure by being released by the church or organization that sponsors the troop. Others are simply unable to continue following a nervous breakdown or the loss of a marginally important appendage. And a surprisingly small number have their Scoutmastering careers cut short with premature death. Don't worry. Famed Scoutmaster Eli Lyman ended his time as the Scoutmaster of Troop 41 by being released by our troop's sponsor, though he would probably tell you he had close brushes with the latter two options as well. When it was announced that Eli would no longer be leading our troop, us boys were devastated. But our disappointment was short-lived, because the sadness brought on by Eli's release was overshadowed by our excitement when Dad was called upon to lead Troop 41. Yes, we would miss hiking over jagged ridges in torrential downpours, and listening to Eli's stories about how bears follow moose and eat their dung, a claim that led to one very long sleepless night following the passage of a moose through our campsite. We'd even miss Eli's dubious advice, like the time he told Marty to cauterize his blisters with a hot knife, or when he announced rattlesnakes can't strike uphill. We'd miss all those things, but no matter how great a Scoutmaster is, there is nothing so much like a dream come true as having your own father serve as your Scoutmaster. Dad had joined us on a number of outings when Eli was Scoutmaster, enduring the 50-miler that stretched into a 76-mile odyssey, and attending our courts of honor, but now he would be leading the troop. Every Wednesday we were guaranteed time with Dad, tying knots, earning merit badges, and repeating the Scout Law. Best of all, Dad would take us on all the hikes and campouts. Looking back, getting my dad as my Scoutmaster was, as I previously mentioned, one of the greatest events of my youth. Things were, of course, different when Dad became Scoutmaster. We no longer met at the American Legion. Dad held the meetings at our house, which everyone was excited about, except my mother and sisters. So I guess there were only 4 of us Joneses who were excited. Mom probably feared for the structural integrity of her home, not to mention the cleanliness of her living room. And the girls weren't keen on the thought of all those smelly Boy Scouts congregating in their house. Dad was also joined by Wilton, another leader whom we boys respected very much, not least because he could out-hike all of us even though a number of decades had passed since he was scouting age. Each troop meeting still began with the repetition of the Scout motto, oath, law, and slogan. We boys worked at it for weeks and had finally managed to get the motto down. With a little bit of incentive from Dad in the form of ice cream sandwiches, all but the least motivated of us managed to get the slogan down as well. The oath and law continued to elude us, though. In addition to this ritual of repeating the Dad and Wilton tasked us with tying the array of knots each Boy Scout should know as we waited for everyone to show up to the meeting. Since the other boys were habitually late, Fred and I became quite good at tying knots, and I can still whip out a bowline, square knot, or a double half hitch at a moment's notice. One Wednesday evening near the end of the summer, Fred and I invited our friend from school, Dylan, to join us at Scouts. Dylan and his family were from the Deep South and had moved to Wyoming the previous year. We had become pretty good friends, and it didn't take long before Dylan was visiting our place with his folks on a regular basis. Even though we officially invited Dylan to Scouts, coming was his idea. In the South, there weren't a lot of real mountains to speak of, and Dylan was itching to join us on one of the expeditions we talked about so frequently. On this particular evening, we boys were gathered in the living room, tying knots and arguing about who would have to lead us in the Scout motto, oath, law, and slogan, when Dad interrupted us with a question we boys had been waiting to hear. "Boys, I'll choose who leads us in the motto, oath, law, and slogan, so stop arguing. Now, are you ready for our overnighter next weekend?" Everyone's heads popped up from their ropes, like so many jack-in-the-boxes, and Cousin Jim even stopped pretending to get strangled by the slip knot my buddy Marty Flincherton had tied around his neck. "Overnighter?" we chorused. Dad's face split into a wide grin. "Yep, we're going to do a hike I've always wanted to try." Here Dad paused for effect, us boys hanging on to every word. "We're going to hike down Carroway Canyon." "Carroway Canyon, Dad? Let's go!" I cheered. The other boys expressed their approval with raucous cheering, and I could just imagine my mom turning up the TV in the basement and heaving a heavy sigh. "Yes," Dad replied. "We'll be leaving next Friday and get back on Saturday evening. I figure we can spend the night down there where we usually fish. There are some relatively flat places there." We Joneses had been fishing Carroway Canyon since fly rods were made out of bamboo and fishing licenses didn't exist, but we had never, to my knowledge, started at the top and hiked all the way down the entire canyon. The distance was far shorter than any of our previous overnight hikes, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to hike leisurely down the mountain and catch tons of fish. I have to admit, I felt sorry this would be Dylan's first hike with us, since he was going to miss out on the invigorating death marches we were so fond of cooking up. Hiking down Carroway Canyon sounded like one of the best hikes we had ever planned. But most plans that go downhill generally sound great before you get started. It was early on Friday morning that we loaded up the bus, which is what we called our 15-passenger van. We trundled up the Red Gulch Dugway into the Bighorn Mountains as the first rays of sunlight started to color the sky in the east, a rosy hue of pink. With each rock the bus rolled over, the groggy Boy Scouts were pitched to and fro. Dad drove with Mom in the passenger seat, since she would need to drive the bus back down the mountain. There were 3 leaders and 8 boys in the group, since Shane, whose son Ike was in the troop, had decided to come along. Looking back, it was a good thing he did. Jim, who made the drive up the mountain many times each summer, managed to fall asleep, but I was wide awake. I never have been able to sleep in a vehicle. The rear seats were crammed with our packs and gear, and Dylan had brought the entire contents of his parents' garage, excluding the cars. I know Dad was pretty concerned about the weight of Dylan's pack, and had even tried talking Dylan's dad out of sending him with some of the bulkier items, like Dylan's winter coat, at least some of the canned goods. But Dylan's dad insisted, reminding Dad that the Scout motto is, "Be prepared." Dad grudgingly conceded, but I could tell he was worried. We boys were just impressed Dylan's dad had the Scout motto memorized, and he wasn't even a Boy Scout. Around 8 a.m., the bus finally ground to a squeaky halt at our family's cabin, high in the Bighorn Mountains on the edge of Carroway Canyon. Us boys piled out, jostling Shane on our way and buzzing with excitement. Dad and Mom unfolded themselves from the front seats of the 15-passenger van, and Wilton straightened up from the first bench seat with creaking joints. Fred hurried to open the back door of the van and began heaving packs out to the waiting Boy Scouts. "Jim," he called, hefting a purple and gold pack out and into Jim's waiting arms. "This one's yours, Fred," he hollered. Then he reached for Dylan's. "Oh, cripes," he grunted, failing to lift Dylan's black pack. It bulged like a small pachyderm, its contents straining against the various straps that enshrouded its lumpy mass. Finally, Shane had to heave on the pack from inside the bus while Fred pulled from the outside, and he only just missed getting crushed by the pack when it fell heavily from the back of the van. "What did you put in there?" Marty asked Dylan, his eyes wide. "What didn't he put in there?" Shane grunted from inside the bus. Everyone was joking good-naturedly, and the excitement was palpable as we shouldered our packs before lining up for the customary before picture. It was a good thing Dad had thrown his handyman jack in the back of the bus, or we never would have gotten Dylan's pack onto his back. When we managed to get it up onto his shoulders, his feet sunk 2 inches into solid rock, and no one could quite understand how he managed to keep it off the ground. "All right, everyone, say Carroway Canyon," Mom trilled as she snapped our picture. "Better look good for this picture," Shane joked. "Search and rescue is going to be looking at it very closely." Mom gave Dad a kiss and climbed back into the bus. "All right," Dad called to all the boys around us. "Do you have everything?" "No, but Dylan does." Ike grinned. Dylan gave a grunt in reply, his legs shaking like reeds in a 40-mile-per-hour wind. We all waved goodbye as Mom drove off, a cloud of dust rising behind the 15-passenger van as it crawled down the deeply rutted road. A shiver ran down my spine, but I quickly disregarded it. It was a lot cooler up here than down in the basin. "Okay, here we go," Dad said, then turned and marched past the little red cabin and began descending into Carroway Canyon, a column of men and boys following along behind. Not surprisingly, Dylan only hiked about the first 100 yards before his legs gave out, and Dad had to reassess his pack. It was to be the first of many pauses on the trip when Dad redistributed some of Dylan's gear. I received a folding shovel and some power tools, while Fred accepted a folding porta-john with an incredulous look. The adult leaders also took some of Dylan's supplies, and with some effort managed to get Dylan back on his feet. We all cheered as Dylan took several shaky steps forward, but our cheers quickly turned to shouts of concern as Dylan let his momentum and gravity do the rest. In awe, us boys watched as Dylan began to pick up speed down the steep incline. Now we were starting to get worried, not in the least by the sound of Dylan yelling on his way down. "Ah!" he yelled, his voice growing fainter as the distance between us increased. Trees and boulders leapt aside to avoid getting crushed. "Ah!" A herd of elk spooked and streaked up the opposite canyon side, sure they were under attack by the largest predator they had ever seen. "Ah!" Wide-eyed, we did our best to keep up, but matching Dylan's pace would have been suicide. "We'll just meet you at the bottom then," Dad called after Dylan. To his credit, Dylan did clear a nice path for the rest of us to follow. In his wake, he left a furrow in the ground 18 inches wide and about a foot deep. Dylan was new to Troop 41, but he seemed to have already mastered our adherence to the principles of leave no trace. I've hiked up a lot of steep mountains in my day, and I'll be the first to tell you that gaining elevation is physically taxing. That morning, as we followed Dylan's path down into Carroway, though, I was introduced to the agony of a prolonged hike downhill with a loaded pack. At first, we chatted and joked as we threaded between trees and over fallen logs, but eventually a burn started in the quads of each man and boy. That burn quickly became an inferno in my legs. On most hikes, I was concerned about the effort of lifting my pack with each step, but now I became acutely aware of how challenging it was becoming to lower my pack without my legs giving out. With each step, I could hear boys and men grunting in pain, our faces contorted into grimaces. "Gee, what I wouldn't give for some flat ground right about now," Jim groaned. "Yeah, and I would even welcome some uphill about now," I said. When at last the ground leveled out somewhat at the bottom of the canyon, I flopped on the ground with the rest of the guys around Dylan and his pack, my quads clenching and unclenching uncontrollably, like my guts after eating something that Scoutmaster Eli Lyman had cooked up. "Fred, my legs won't stop twitching," I grunted. "Mine neither," he said. "I'm glad that's over." Dad and the other leaders helped roll Dylan's pack so that his feet were touching the ground again, and began pulling out more items. "I just thought I'd get it over with, you know," Dylan was saying. "I'm sure I can stay with the group from here on out, though." Dad nodded and passed Shane an electric can opener, which he slid into his pack with raised eyebrows. "All right, everybody," Dad said, straightening up and looking west down the canyon. "Let's go find the creek. The water doesn't start until further down. It actually comes straight out of the ground. Come on, Dylan." There you have it. End of part 1 of That Time Things Went Downhill Pretty Much from the Beginning. Next week, well, I guess in a couple of weeks, we will give you part 2, in which Troop 41 continues their trek down Carroway Canyon. And let me tell you, part 2 is going to be a nail biter because, well, I won't ruin it for you, but I'll just say you're going to want to listen to part 2 of this episode. So, anyways, Carroway Canyon, like I said, we had fished there as a Jones family since the early 1900s. And I did look it up. They didn't start issuing fishing licenses in Wyoming until 1937. So I'm sure there were Joneses fishing in Carroway Canyon before the advent of fishing licenses to Wyoming. The Game and Fish of Wyoming did implement a bag limit, as they called it, that allowed you to keep up to 20 pounds of trout in a day. So when the Joneses first came to Wyoming, the only rule that existed for fishing was that you couldn't keep more than 20 pounds of trout on a single day. So, Carroway Canyon has been in the family for a long time, and I'm excited to share the rest of this story with you next week. As always, this has been another Untold Tale from this side of nowhere, and you can reach me at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions, which reminds me, this story I'm telling because I received an email from one of our listeners. A big shout out to Judy in Otto. So Judy, thanks for sending me an email and reminding me of this event in the fabled history of Troop 41. I'm glad you sent in the suggestion, and I'm making good on it. So, if you want to be like Judy and inspire a story for the podcast, be sure to shoot me an email or respond to any of our posts on Facebook. Send me a message on Messenger through our Facebook page for Untold Tales, the podcast. And I look forward to hearing from you. Now, as always, this has been another Untold Tale from this side of nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much and still find time for the important things, like fishing. Catch you next time, folks.